light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. In conversations, sometimes I meet people who are very adversarial, people who seem to be hunting for an argument, and I'm not particularly interested in providing one for them. So one of the tactics I often use is to go to questions and to become, especially in that moment, a seeker of truth. I think I'm a seeker of truth most of the time anyway, and I think that most, if not all, genuine spirituality is about seeking truth, seeking higher truth, seeking divine truth. In meeting someone who initially approaches as adversarial, though, sometimes I think they're trying to manipulate or control me, and their first intention is to make me defensive. I feel no reason to be defensive toward them, however, because if all they're doing is words, there really is nothing about their words that guarantees truth, that insists that anything they say is right. I mean, they could walk up to somebody and say, "You have green hair," and obviously the person doesn't, and you kind of go, okay, this person may be crazy, may be hallucinating, maybe something, I don't know, but clearly what they're saying isn't true, and so we don't worry about them saying something bad. So if someone walks up to you and says, "You're being insensitive," instead of saying, "I am not," which assumes that what they said is true, to instead come back with a question of saying, what would make you think that? Or if somebody makes an outlandish statement, maybe not even directed to me personally, to be able to respond by asking for more information. That knowing truth in the higher sense also includes, bit by bit, knowing better and better the truth of each other. So that when someone says, "I believe this," and you could, with no judgment, no criticism, whatever, just say, "Oh, really? What makes you believe that? Or upon what do you base that?" And by asking questions persistently, in some situations like that, I found that it diffuses the argument, it sets aside the adversity. In the end, we may even part as friends. But a lot of that will come from asking the questions that allow me to know them better. Not know them so that I can control them, not know them so I can manipulate them, but to know them so that I can understand them. So that perhaps at some point I can even begin to understand what it is that really, really matters to them. I think at a spiritual level, most people are looking for that connection, for that wholeness, that undescribable sort of inner peace. And yet it's not just peace, but it's a specific kind of peace. If it were just peace, then simply the absence of violence would be enough. But it's not just peace that we're looking for. And so that's where we come back to embracing persistent questions. I suppose you could even say embracing persistent questions could be a form of spirituality, because it's by asking those questions that we continue to move forward, embrace new things, discover new ways of looking, new ways of seeing, new landscapes to explore. So, which is a little difficult without a specific example in mind, because I'm trying to address something important, but it's kind of a generality until we have a specific example. But of course, that's the whole point of questions too. That when you meet someone, instead of assuming you know them, instead of judging them according to their category, according to their national affiliation or religious affiliation, to instead understand with every person you meet, this is a unique, wonderful person with complexities I haven't imagined, and I really don't know them. And from that place to begin by saying, "Hi, how are you? what do you think is the significance of this, or what is the importance of that, or how can I help you, or what is it that you're seeking? To begin to invite information from the other person, to begin to invite truth from the other person, and to not always be as concerned about about scorekeeping, about making sure that my statements and my beliefs and my claims have at least equal time as theirs. Because it may not be necessary for them to know what you know, because really it's not, that in itself would be presumptuous actually, because to assume that they need to know what you know is to make presumptions about what they want to know, what they need to know, what challenges they're facing. It could be that the challenge with which they're wrestling, which they may even perceive you as an adversary in some sense. There are people who are involved in spiritual searching, and they see someone as unusual as me, and they may find that threatening because what they're looking for, they think, is something familiar and traditional and common and ordinary and usual. And there's nothing particularly typical or ordinary or usual about Sister Who. That when I enter the picture, it's much more about constructive spiritual change, about growth, about exceeding boundaries. When I was going through my master's program, we'd often get into the discussion of different kinds of ministry, and it became clear to me after a while that I really am not oriented to congregational ministry, but more to the ministry of what's commonly called a retreat center, or a spiritual center where people come to experience something new. It seems to me that the ministry of the retreat center and the ministry of the congregation of the community church are complementary but opposite. If you have too much change within a community church, you wind up with the congregation splitting because people aren't sure how to integrate that much, those extremes of change and that extreme of discovery. But if you go to a spiritual retreat center or a spiritual center where they're offering a workshop or a seminar in dealing with this or that issue, if you don't find some sort of constructive change, something that you didn't find in church, something additional, something empowering, then it's as if the center really hasn't done its job. Which brings us back to this point of persistent questions. That on one level there is this superficial adversity. How could you think that? How could you do that? Aren't you concerned about? But instead of responding defensively, to instead acknowledge that as something worthwhile to say, and to begin to ask those persistent questions, so that if they have an agenda that they want you to believe or agree or say or do or whatever, they'll probably get really frustrated because the questions are literally endless. They're open, they're expansive, and that's actually something very empowering. So as you're asking these questions, either the person who was initially adversarial will give up being adversarial, or they'll leave, or at the very least you'll walk away with much more information than you started, and you'll have much more of a sense of what is their real concern. That when someone meets Sister Who and is on a spiritual quest of some sort but wanted something traditional, that may become clearer through the dialogue and the questions and the conversation. But it may also help to refine things for them so that they can continue their search in a much more targeted fashion. So that when someone says they want something familiar, something traditional, something comfortable, something usual, and you could say, oh, you mean like the Orthodox Church? Well, maybe, no, I didn't mean that conservative, or maybe they wanted high church or low church. Maybe they feel more at home in a Buddhist meditation circle. It could be any number of things. But the more we ask questions, the more we find out which specific truth is needed in this specific challenging situation. The neat thing about asking persistent questions, though, to me, is that it pretty much diffuses and excludes open physical violence. And for that matter, even verbal violence is very difficult to maintain if the only thing they're getting is questions. The person always asking for more clarification. And they make a statement and the other person says, oh, then you must mean this. Well, no, that's not really what I meant. Well, okay, then you must mean this. Well, no, that's not either. It's, well, what is it between this and this that is what you mean? And suddenly you have someone who's actively listening and someone who's talking, and that in itself is a gesture of mutual respect. Mutual respect, of course, works in the opposite direction from adversity. If someone's going to be adversarial, the one thing that they don't want or that will kind of sabotage the momentum of their negative emotion is if they suddenly are respected. And if that respect can also be mutual, that when they try to require an answer, it's not given. Instead, they get another question. That when someone says, well, of course you believe such and such, and the other person says, well, it would depend on whether it was this or whether it was that. And maybe it's a distinction that the first person hadn't even thought of at that point. I guess what's behind all this for me is just, that point of being able to effectively avoid violence. And once we can begin to avoid it in our bodies, with our words, with our, there's no fighting, there's no fists, there's no shooting, there's no warfare in an open sense, then we can move it up to the psychological and emotional levels and begin to eliminate the violence from our minds, and then to remove the violence from our mouths, from the words we use, and to allow the language to evolve in civil, mutually respectful, mutually empowering ways. That it's not about beating the other person in a debate, it's not about dominating or controlling or manipulating the other person, but it's rather about finding out about the other person, getting to know them. And even if the questions seem real scientific and objective and lacking in any feeling whatsoever, there is still, by the mere fact of respectfully and calmly asking the questions, there is that mutual respect going on that is simply a lesser degree of love. And as a person feels loved, it is much more difficult, I believe, for them to continue to feel adversarial. In the absence of love, of course, all manner of evil and malice and violence becomes completely possible. The persistent questions, however, even as we're asking the other person, offer something back to ourselves as well, because in asking someone for their answer, somewhere in the back of our mind, we immediately start thinking about what would be our answer to it. And if we're quick, and if we know to think of it, that even as we recognize what our answer to that question would be, we immediately remind ourselves but that's not necessarily what this person's answer will be. And if their answer is different, then there are more questions I can ask in order to come to a much deeper and more complete understanding of them. The questions ultimately are for building the relationships. The answers, the adversity, conversely, is what has the potential to destroy relationships. The only time questions would have the ability to potentially destroy a relationship is if it was a question that the other person simply didn't want to answer. And so once again, really, the problem is not the question, but the answer, or the resistance to there being an answer. But there's a whole lot of situations that can be diffused simply by being quick with a question. Even if it's as basic as, what do you mean by that? But to be able to say it in a way that is not challenging, because there is nothing really to be gained from playing King of the Hill with words. The problem with the basic children's playground game of King of the Hill, is using it as a metaphor, is that essentially nobody gets to be king forever. Some who argue for this say, well, everyone gets a turn, but that's not necessarily true either, because to a large extent it depends upon strength. And each of us is strong in some areas and weak in others. There may be some who are incredibly strong in their minds and weak in their bodies, and vice versa. If we begin to exclude people because they don't have the kind of strength or in reference to questions and answers, they don't have the kind of answers we want. We wind up impoverishing ourselves, and we wind up impoverishing the world around us, because that person has something valuable to contribute, has a perspective, has an insight, has a different way of looking at things, that even if it's not our answer, will give us a broader sense of what the problem is if we know more information before we answer. The thing about getting more information, about getting responses to all the questions, is that your answer to the central concern may not change. But you will make that decision or take that action with a much broader frame of reference, with a much greater sense of a grounded, secure answer that has been questioned and measured and tested. And after all of that, we still look in the mirror and say, yeah, I think that is the right answer. I think that's, or if there is no clear right or wrong answer, it is the answer to which I'm willing to commit myself. The wondrous thing about questions, I guess, is that they are so open and expansive. Whereas adversity is about shrinking, questions is about expanding. Where fear is about shrinking, love is about expanding. There is a sense, consequently, in which one could say that questions are really the more loving way to answer in any and every conversation, and the more loving way to begin a conversation. If every conversation begins with an answer instead of begins with a question instead of an answer, then it has somewhere to go. It has some continuity. It has some future. If we provide only answers, there's no future. It's just a dead end, because the answer effectively stops the thought, stops the sentence, stops the conversation. In order for it to continue, somebody has to come up with another question. During my years and in my master's education, getting a master's in theological studies, one of the things that frequently stood out to me is the stories of various mystics. And I found it interesting how those who were described as mystics often had more in common with each other than they had with their own religions. But the thing I noticed about the mystics is that they were much more fascinated by the essence of God than the form. They're much more fascinated by questions rather than answers. And yet, that kind of open-ended approach gave them a much larger universe in which to live. When we ask persistent questions, it is important to keep in mind, though, that some of those questions are horrendously sensitive and might hurt, because you have no idea what the person went through or what that question might mean to them. Sometimes having a conversation with another person could be a virtual landmine where there's all kinds of personal history that will get in the way of the conversation. To me, that is still not enough of a reason not to do it. But it does mean that it is imperative to proceed with gentleness and cautiousness and sensitivity. When I was in college, I had a friend who went on to become a Lutheran minister, actually, who remarked to me at one point that to be strong is to be gentle. The one who cannot be gentle is not truly strong. That's really more the heart of it. The one who cannot be gentle is not truly strong. It takes a good amount of strength to be gentle. It is not something that ever happens by accident or by default. It's always something that has to be done with deliberate intention. Gentleness and sensitivity, the love that doesn't step on people's toes or squash people, the love that is not hard and abrasive, but the love that is challenging and inspiring, and even while doing so, it is the love that empowers, the love that leads us to discover our own strength, strength that frequently we've forgotten. To rediscover that strength, though, the thing that I keep coming back to is the questions. By asking the questions, we find the greater truth of ourselves and of those around us, the truth of our relationships, of any description. And in embracing that truth, well, in order to embrace the truth, we have to embrace the questions. In embracing the questions, we embrace the truth. In embracing the truth, we wind up embracing a much richer, deeper, broader, better experience of life. The focus of this episode, however, is conversationally. How do we relate to others? And when others relate to us in an adversarial fashion. Part of me wonders if it doesn't have a lot to do with running from their own truth. That as long as they don't want something to be true, they can pretend, that they can all sorts of peculiar strategies that people have been known to use. But if you're running from your own truth, there's never going to be there won't be any peace in running from your own truth, you are attempting to run from yourself, and you can't run away from yourself, because everywhere you go, you find that it's still with you, because you brought it with you. A lot of times we don't realize what kind of stuff we're carrying, but if we ask enough questions, and if we pay attention to the experiences that we do have, at some point it does become infinitely more clear what the real issue is. And if you're running away from something, especially if you're running away from something using addictions, using addictive substances, whether it's alcohol or drugs or smoking or sweet, sugary foods or any number of things, these are all ways that we run away from our own truth, because we're afraid of our own questions, because we don't have, or we don't, I don't think it's that we don't have the courage to ask them, as that we have made a choice that not facing them, not embracing them, seems like it will be more desirable in the long run, because you won't have to do the work of integrating whatever you find. You won't have to accept that actually there is no final answer to any question. That we wrestle through things, we go over them again and again and again and again. And it's not tedium to go over them again and again, as it is, here's another opportunity, we don't want you to miss out. Here's another opportunity, we don't want you to miss out. In divine mercy, I guess you could say, we keep getting more chances. Frequently, many more second chances than any of us typically give someone else. To find out what to do with those chances, though, and to utilize them to their best ability, requires asking lots of questions. Because usually when those sorts of remarkable, well, anything that's remarkable, when it's presented, it is remarkable because it's not common, because it's not familiar, because it's not the way things are usually done. And in order to utilize it effectively, you have to begin to ask questions about, what does this material do? And what does this material require? And once you get a basic sense of the properties and potentialities of any particular material, to then move beyond that into how it empowers or specifically builds up or tears down somebody's life. The biggest thing, or the most important aspect to me, I guess, about questions is not to be afraid of them, and not to shut them down permanently, though there may be times where questioning needs to be suspended for a time in order to focus on something else. But it's imperative that when that something else is finished, that you come back to wrestling with the question again, because the whole reason questions present themselves in the first place is specifically so that growth and development and discovery can occur. And if we don't answer a question or discovery and just go racing on ahead, we'll have, presumably or quite possibly, we won't know how to resolve the challenges we find there, because we won't have learned how what we already have could be the answer we seek, and consequently that we don't have to try taking our living tissue and fitting it into a predefined mold that some other person or institutionalized religion or organization has created for us. That instead we can say, that's just not who I am. And, all the different pieces of the puzzle are going to have to figure something out. Because I'm here, I exist, and I exist because evidently God felt that the world needed somebody exactly like me. Thank you very much for watching. I hope the comments and thoughts I've shared in the last half hour have been helpful to you to fuel your own inspiration and to help you to find all of your questions genuinely empowering. Thank you.